Hello and welcome back to Storytime Classics Live. It is Pandemic Monday. I say Pandemic Monday because I'm with our guest reader, Oscar de las Salas, and it's every day is a pandemic day. It's Pandemic Tuesday tomorrow.
It's pandemic Tuesday. So exactly. Until we find a vaccine, it'll be a pandemic. It's just like that's your surname, pandemic.
Pandemic.
What's your
So
name,
within
pandemic
this,
Oscar?
yes. Well, within this pandemic world, we have our fall festival tickets on sale now. I think very, very few, if any, are still in-person tickets. There, I believe, only 24 people allowed in the audience. So that's going to be a very rare opportunity there. But it's still a very rare opportunity because you also have the chance to purchase virtual tickets. You can watch this at the same time streaming from the comfort of your own home and see these incredible performers. And I believe some of them are Patrick Page. We have Trezana Beverly, Tony Award winner Trezana Beverly. And we have Deborah-Ann Bird and Lisa Volpe all performing their one-person shows, and just fantastic talent and very interesting. So anyone that's that's interested about that, and I really advise looking into this, please write to info@swshakespeare.org for more information. And you'll be glad you did. It's going to be a really amazing lineup. So look into that. Also, tomorrow we're going to have another guest speaker, as I will be unavailable on other Southwest Shakespeare business. And we will have Leanne reading, in keeping with our Ray Bradbury theme, she will be reading The Sound of Thunder and Ilya. So look forward to that. Those are really great science fiction stories, and I'm kind of jealous, but I'm very glad that she'll be reading those. So tune in and enjoy that tomorrow. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Oscar, who has been waiting patiently as I get everything out of the way and prepare the way for Love in the Time of Cholera. Hello, Oscar. How are you this morning?
Very good, Bo. Just another pandemic Monday, like we said. And I'm very happy to hear that the fall festival tickets are on sale. And I'm so very happy to know that perhaps they're all sold out. I mean, 25 people, that's very easy.
I certainly hope so. It's a chance to be up close and as personal as you can be, given COVID guidelines and everything that you must follow these days, just so everybody is safe. But it is still a very intimate experience, whether it be on video or live in person, and it is surely not to be missed.
I hope people just purchase and also attend the virtual play as well. So there's plenty to choose from, and this is a great opportunity and the ability to support Southwest Shakespeare as well.
Exactly. So where are we today in Love in the Time of Cholera? What is currently going on?
Believe it or not, we are going up the stream with Florentino Ariza in a boat over the river up to the Andes. And then there is a civil war in the country between liberals and conservatives. So there is an internal war. It's a civil war happening. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there is a pandemic going on. And the name of the pandemic is cholera. Any parallel to reality? In any event...
I'm not seeing anything.
No kidding. Oh, my God. Anyway, Mary Way may not like this comment, but the book is amazing. But that's what is happening. So we'll see what happens. This is not the reality. It's a fiction novel. It's a love novel. And I'm going to continue to read as we go and see what happens with this incredible love story.
Well, excellent. I will let you continue with that. I will turn things over to you. Thank you very much, Oscar, for reading again today. Great to talk with you. And take it away.
Thank you, Bo. So
Thank you.
Thank you. This is Love in the Time of Cholera for those of you that are reading with me. I have some questions and comments from some of you. I have received several emails, so thank you for sending me those emails and those questions. I decided to take the reading outside. It's a beautiful, beautiful fall day in Phoenix. I'm even wearing a sweater, and I'm in our backyard. And I decided to read outdoors because this time of the year is fantastic that we can do so. So join me for the reading. We are on page 141 of this version of this book of Love in the Time of Cholera, and it was written by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And where are we in the story? By the way, the story is getting complicated and layered, if you would. But Florentino Ariza is trying to forget Fermina Daza. So she ran into him, and she ran into him in a plaza, and then she told him, "Nope, I don't want to see you anymore. This is it. It's over. I'm not in love with you anymore." And then Fermina Daza's cousin was in the city at that time, in Cartagena, the city at the time, and then she helped her to go through the process of forgetting him, and then kind of falling in love with Dr. Juvenal Urbino, Dr. Urbino. And then Florentino Ariza decides, just like, I'm totally broken hearted, I'm just going to leave. And off he decided to talk to his uncle, and then go up the stream in the boat up to the Andes, to a town that is up in the Andes, and forget about the love of his life, trying to. And then during that time, like I was just mentioning to Bo, and this is absolutely true as well, there was a civil war happening in Colombia, liberals versus conservatives. And there were difficult times because you were not able to go up the stream to the Andes, because some of the ports were taken by either part, and there were fights and happening between the two of them. And on top of that, the country had the pandemic of cholera happening, and it took a lot of people in Colombia. So all these elements are not part of a fiction. Remember that Gabriel Garcia Marquez writes parallels between what is fantasy or what is fiction and reality. And that's the way that his way of writing, or the type of writing he does, is called magic realism. Within the world of your real life, or the world of reality, there is a portion of magic. But these two factors that I just mentioned, one, the Civil War, second, the cholera pandemic, were real at this time when the book is narrated. Let's continue on page 141. Moreover, another episode of intermittent civil war between liberals and conservatives had broken out that year, and the captain had taken very strict precautions to maintain internal order and protect the safety of the passengers, trying to avoid misunderstandings and provocations. He prohibited the favorite pastime during the river voyages in those days, which was to shoot the alligators, sunning themselves on the broad sandy banks. Later on, when some of the passengers divided in two opposing camps during an argument, he confiscated everyone's weapons and gave his word of honor that they will be returned to them at the end of the journey, trying to contain the political arguments too, basically. He was inflexible even with the British minister, who, on the morning following their departure, appeared in a hunting outfit with a precision carbine and double-barrel rifle for killing tigers. The restrictions became even more drastic above the port of Tenerife. That's one of the ports going up north in Cartagena, in Colombia, where they passed a boat flying a yellow plague flag. Remember, the cholera. The captain could not obtain any further information regarding that alarming sign because the other vessel did not respond to any of his signals. But the same day, they encountered another boat with a cargo of cattle from Jamaica, and were informed that the vessel with the plague flag was carrying two people sick with cholera, and that the epidemic was wreaking havoc along the portion of the river they still had to travel. Then the passengers was prohibited from leaving the boat, not only in the ports, but even in the uninhabited places where they stopped to take on wood, so that until they reached the final port, a trip of 6 days, the passengers acquired the habits of prisoners, including including the contemplation of a packet of pornographic Dutch postcards that circulated from hand to hand without anyone's knowing where it came from. Although no veteran of the river was unaware that this was the only way, and a tiny sampling of the Capitan legendary collection. But in the end, the distraction with no expectation only increased their tedium. I just want to take a quick break here because I remember clearly that in Colombia we had Dutch people coming in through the Caribbean, and as you know, they are very knowledgeable of hydraulics, and Germans as well from at that time. So, like I mentioned to some of you once, Cartagena, being in the Caribbean and being one of the oldest ports in the country, had seen the world and people from the world from one single location. And it's a very interesting thing. Florentino Ariza endured the hardships of the journey with mineral patience that had brought sorrow to his mother and exasperation to his friends. He spoke to no one. The days were easy for him, and as he sat at the rail watching the motionless alligators sunning themselves on sandy banks, their mouths open to catch butterflies, warning the flocks of the startled herons that rose without warning from the marshes, the manatees that nursed their young and large maternal rats, and startled the passengers with their woman cries. On a single day, he saw three bloated green human corpses float past, with buzzards sitting on them. First, the bodies of two men went by, one of them without a head, and then a very young girl whose Medusan locks undulated in the boat's wake. He never knew, because no one ever knew, if they were victims of the cholera or if they were victims of the war. But the nauseating stench contaminated his memory of Fermina Daza. That was always the case. In any event, good or bad, had some relationships to her. At night, when the boat was anchored and most of the passengers walked the decks in despair, he perused and illustrated novels he knew almost by heart under the carbide lamp in the dining room, which was the only one kept burning until dawn. And the dramas he had read so often regained their original magic when he replaced the imaginary protagonist with people he knew in real life, reserving himself and Fermina Daza for the roles that star-crossed lovers. On other nights, he wrote anguished letters and then scattered them in fragments over the water that flowed toward her without pause. And so the most difficult hours passed for him, at times in the person of a timid prince or a paladin of love, at other times in his own scalded hide of a lover in the middle of forgetting, until the first breezes began to blow and he went to doze in the lounge chairs by the railing. One night, when he stopped his reading earlier than usual and was walking distracted towards the toilets, a door opened as he passed through the dining room, and a hand like the talon of a hawk seized him by the shirt and pulled him into a cabin. In the darkness, he could barely see the naked woman, who pushed him into the bunk face up, unbuckled his belt, unbuttoned his trousers, impaled herself on him, as if she were riding a horseback, and stripped him down without glory of his virginity. Both of them fell in agony of desire into the void of a bottomless pit that smelled of salt marsh full of prawns. Then she lay for a moment on top of him, gasping for breath, and she ceased to exist in the darkness. Now go and forget all about it, she said. This never happened. The assault had been so rapid and so triumphant that it could not only be understood not as a sudden madness because by boredom, but as a fruit of a plan elaborated over time and down to its smallest detail. The gratifying certainty increased. Florentino Ariza's eagerness for the height of pleasure he had experienced, a revelation that could not believe, that he even refused to admit, which was that his illusory love for Fermina Daza could be replaced by an earthly passion. And so it was that he felt compelled to discover the identity of the mistress of violation in whose panther's instincts he may find the cure for his misfortune. But he was not successful, not at all. On the contrary, the more he delved into the search, the further he felt from the truth. The assault had taken place in the last cabin, but this communicated with the one next to it by a door, so that the two rooms had been converted into a family sleeping quarters with four bunks. The occupants were two young women, another who was rather mature but very attractive, and an infant a few months old. They had boarded in Barranco de la Loba, that's one of the ports, the port where cargo and passengers from Mompox, one of the cities in the Caribbean, were picked up ever since that city had been excluded from the itineraries of steamboats because of the river's caprices. And Florentino Ariza had noticed them only because they carried the sleeping child in a large birdcage. They dressed as if they were traveling on a fashionable ocean liner, with bustles under their silk skirts and lace gorgets and broad-brimmed hats trimmed with creoling flowers. And the two younger women changed their entire outfits several times a day, so that they seemed to carry with them their own spring-like ambience, while other passengers were suffocating in the heat. All three were skilled in the use of parasols and feather fans, but their intentions were as indecipherable as those of other women in Mompox. Florentino Ariza could not even determine their relationship to one another, although he had no doubt they came from the same family. At first, he thought that the older one might be the mother of the other two, but then he realized she was not old enough for that. And then she also wore partial mourning that the others did not share. He could not imagine that one of them would have dared to do what she did while the others were sleeping in nearby bunks. And the only reasonable supposition was that she had taken advantage of a fortuitous or perhaps prearranged moment when she was alone in the cabin. He observed that at times two of them stayed out for a breath of cool air until very, very late, while the third remained behind, caring for the infant. But one night, when it was very hot, all the three of them left the cabin, carrying the baby, who was asleep in the wicker cage covered with gauze. Despite the tangles of clues, Florentino Ariza soon rejected the possibility that the oldest had been the perpetrator of the assault, and with as much dispatch, he also absolved the youngest. who was the most beautiful and the boldest of the three. He did so without valid reasons, but only because his avid observations of the three women had persuaded him to accept as truth the profound hope that his sudden lover was in fact the mother of the caged infant. That supposition was so seductive that he began to think about about her with more intensity than he thought about Fermina Daza. Ignoring the evidence that this recent mother lived only for her child, she was no more than 25. She was slender and golden. She had Portuguese eyelids that made her seem very more aloof, and any man would have been satisfied with only the crumbs of her tenderness that she lavished on her son. From breakfast until bedtime, she was busy with him in the salon, while the other two played Chinese checkers, and when at last she managed to put him to sleep, she would hang the wicker cage from the ceiling on the cooler side of the railing. She did not ignore him, however, when she was asleep, but would rock the cage, singing love songs under her breath, while her thoughts flew high above the miseries of the journey. Florentino Arisa clung to the illusion that sooner or later she would betray herself, if only with a gesture. He even observed the changes in her breathing, watching the reliquary that hung on on the batiste blouse as he looked at her without dissimulation over the book that he pretended to read. And he committed the calculated impertinence of changing his seat in the dining room so that he would face her. But he could not find the slightest hint that she was in fact the repository of the other half of his secret. The only thing of hers she had, and that only because her younger companion called to her, was her first name, Rosalba. On the eighth day, the boat navigated with great difficulty through a turbulent strait squeezed between marble cliffs, and after lunch it anchored in Puerto Nare. That's another port. This was the disembarkation point for those passengers who would continue the journey to Antioquia, another location of the country, one of the provinces most affected by the new civil war. The port consisted of half a dozen palm huts and a store made out of wood with a zinc roof, and it was protected by several squads of barefoot and ill-armed soldiers because there had been rumors of a plan by insurrection soldiers because of a plan of insurrection to plunder the boats. That's absolutely true as well. I have other commentary about that, but it's too long. Behind the houses reaching to the sky rose a promontory of uncultivated highland with a wrought iron cornice at the edge of the precipice. No one on board slept well that night, but the attack did not materialize, and in the morning the port was transformed into a Sunday affair, with Indians selling tagua amulets and love potions amid packs of animals ready to begin the 6-day ascent to the orchid jungles of the central mountain range. Florentino Arisa passed the time watching black men unloading the boat into into their bags. He watched them carry off crates of china and pianos for for the sprinters of Envigado, and he did not realize until it was too late that Rosalba and her party were among the passengers who had stayed on shore. He saw them when they were already sitting side saddle with their Amazon boots and their parasols in equatorial colors, and then he took the step he had not dared to take during the preceding days. He waved to Rosalba, and the three women responded in kind, with a familiarity that cut to him to the quick because his boldness came too late. He saw them round the corner of the store, followed by the mules carrying their trunks, their hat boxes, and their baby's cage. And soon afterward, he saw them ascending along the edge of the precipice like a line of ants that disappear from his life. Then he felt alone in the world, and the memory of Fermina Daza lying in ambush in recent days dealt him with a mortal blow. He knew that she was to have an elaborate wedding, and then the being and then the being who loved her most, who would love her forever, would not have would not even have the right to die for her. Jealousy, which until that time had been drowned in weeping, took possession of his soul. He prayed to God that the lighting of the divine justice will strike Fermina Daza as she was about to give her vow of love and obedience to a man who wanted her for his life only as a social adornment. And he went into rapture at the vision of the bride, his bride, or no one's lying face up on the flagstones of the cathedral, her orange blossoms laden with dew of death, and the foaming torrent of her veil covering the funerary marbles of the 14 bishops who were buried in front of the main altar. Once his revenge was consummated, however, he repented of his own weakness, and then he saw Fermina Daza rising from the ground, her spirit intact, distant but alive, because it was not possible for him to imagine the world without her. He did not sleep again, and if at time he sat down to pick at to pick at food, it was in the hope that Fermina Daza would be at the table, or conversely, to deny her homage of fasting for her sake. At times, his solace was the certainty that during the intoxication of her wedding celebration, even during the feverish nights of her honeymoon, Fermina Daza would suffer one moment, one least but one, in any event, when the phantom of the sweetheart she had scorned, humiliated, and insulted would appear in the thoughts, and all her happiness would be destroyed. The night before they reached the port of Karakoli, which was at the end of the journey, the captain gave the traditional farewell party with a woodwind orchestra composed of crew members and fireworks from the bridge. The minister from Great Britain had survived the Odyssey with exemplary exorcism, shooting with his camera the animals they would not allow him to kill with his rifles. And not one night went by that he was not seen in the evening dress in the dining room. But he came to the final party wearing the tartans of the MacTavish clan, and he played the bagpipe for everyone, entertainment, and taught those who were interested how to dance his national dances. And before daybreak, he almost had to be carried to his cabin. Florentino Ariza, prostrate with grief, he had gone to the farthest corner of the deck while the noise of the revelry could not reach him. And he put on Natalia Thugger's overcoat in an effort to overcome the shivering of his bones. He had awakened at 5 in the morning, as the condemned man awakens at dawn one day of his execution. And for the entire day, he had done nothing but imagine, minute by minute, each of the events at Fermina Daza's wedding. Later, when he returned home, he realized that he had made a mistake in the time, and mistake in the time. And that evening, he had been different from what he had imagined, and he had even had good sense to laugh at his fantasy. That's right. He made a mistake on the dates, and he was just going through his mental process, but he messed up the dates. But in any case, it was Saturday of Passion, which culminated in a new crisis of fever when he thought the moment had come for the newlyweds to flee in secret through a false door to give themselves over to the delights of their first night. Someone saw him shivering with fever and informed the captain, who, fearing of a case of cholera, left the party with the ship's doctor, and the doctor took the precaution of sending Florentino to the quarantine cabin with a dose of bromides. The next day, however, when they sighted the cliffs of Caracoli, his fever had disappeared and his spirits were elated, because in the marasmus of the sedatives, he had resolved once and for all that he did not give a damn about the brilliant future of the telegraph, and that he would take this very same boat back to his old street of windows. It was not difficult to persuade it was not difficult to persuade them to give him return passage in exchange for the cabin he had surrendered to the representative of Queen Victoria. The captain also attempted to dissuade him, arguing that the telegraph was the science of the future. So much so, he said, that they were already devising a system for installing it on boats. But he resisted all arguments, and in the end, the captain took him home, not because he owed him the price of the cabin, but because he knew of his excellent connections to the river company of the Caribbean. The trip downriver took less than 6 days, and Florentino Ariza felt that he was home again from the moment they entered the Mercedes Lagoon. At dawn, and he saw the trail of lights of the fishing canoes undulating in the wake of the boat. It was still dark when they docked in El Nino Perdido Cove, 9 leagues from the bay and the last port of river boats until the old Spanish Channel was dragged and put back into service. The passengers would have to wait until 6 o'clock in the morning to board the fleet of sloops for hire that would carry them to the final destination. But Florentino Ariza was so eager that he sailed much more earlier on the Mall sloop, whose crew acknowledged him as one of their own. Before he left the boat, he succumbed to temptation to a symbolic act. He threw his petate into the water. That's his carrier, his shoulder carrier. He threw his petate into the water and followed it with his eyes as it floated past the beacon of lights of the invisible fisherman. It left the lagoon and disappeared into the ocean. He was sure he would not need it again for all the rest of his days. Never again, because never again would he abandon the city of Fermina Daza. The bay was calm at daybreak. Above the floating mist, Florentino Ariza saw the dome of the cathedral. Gilded by the first light of dawn, he saw the death coats. Oh, okay. The death coats of the flat roofs. And orienting himself by them, he located the balcony of the palace of the Marquis of Casalduero, where he supposed that the lady of his misfortune was still dozing, her head on the shoulder of her satiated husband. The idea broke his heart, but he did nothing to suppress it. On the contrary, he took pleasure in his pain. The sun was beginning to grow hot as the mail sloop made its way through the labyrinth of the sailing ships that lay at anchor, where the countless otters from the public market and the decaying matter on the bottom of the bay blended into one pestilential stench. The schooner from Riohacha had just arrived, and gangs of stevedores in water up to their waist lifted the passengers over the side, and carried them to the shore. Florentino Ariza was the first to jump on land from the mail sloop, and from that time on, he no longer detected the fetid reek of the bay in the city, but he was aware only of the personal fragrance of Fermina Daza. Everything smelled of her. He was just so in love, I can't believe. In the time of cholera. How about that? So continue on the reading. He did not return to the telegraph office. His only interest seemed to be serialized love novels and the volumes of popular library that his mother continued to buy for him and that he continued to read again and again and again, lying in his hammock, until he learned them by heart. He did not even ask for his violin. He reestablished relations with his closest friends, and sometimes they played billiards or conversed in the outdoor cafes under the arches around the plaza for the cathedral. But he did not go back to the Saturday night dances. He could not conceive of them without her. On the morning of his return from his inclusive journey, he learned that Fermina Daza was spending her honeymoon in Europe, and his agitated heart took it for granted that she would live there, if not forever, then for many years to come. He thought of Rosalba, whose memory burned brighter as the others once dimmed. It was during this time that he grew the mustache with the wax tips that he would keep for the rest of his life, and that he changed his entire being, and the idea of substituting one love for another carried him along surprising paths. Oh, so that okay. So this is part of the sorry, the question here is this is the part of the book that he realizes that he can no longer love Fermina Daza as he wanted to because she married. Therefore, he wanted to find um, his he wanted to find the meaning of love by seducing other women. And by the way, seducing a lot of women. So he was trying to find the meaning of love by having basically sex with every single woman that he was able to. On the morning of his return from his inconclusive journey, he learned that Fermina Daza was spending her honeymoon in Europe, and his agitated heart took it for granted that she would live there, if not forever, then for many years to come. He thought of Rosalva, whose memory burned brighter as the other ones deemed. It was during this time that he grew the mustache with the wax tips that he would keep for the rest of his life, and that changed his entire being. And the idea of making a substitute of one love for another carried him along in surprising paths. Little by little, the fragrance of Fermina Daza became less frequent and less intense, and at last it remained only in white gardenias. One night during the war, he was drifting with not knowing what direction his life should take. The celebrated window Nazareth took refuge in his house because hers had been destroyed by the canyon fire during the siege by the rebel Generaldo Ricardo Gaitan Obeso. That's a very actually. I'm amazed by some of the real names and locations that he talks about in the book. I just totally forgot that Gabriel Garcia Marquez, combines the reality and the fantasy so well that you totally forget that you are reading a fantasy, which in reality it seems like it's reality until something strange happens or something else that it looks like a fantasy or magical comes in. It was Transito Ariza, that's his mother, who took control of the situation and sent the widow to her son's bedroom on the pretext that there was no space in hers, but actually in the hope that another love would cure him of one that did not allow him to live. So the mother, Transito Ariza, sent this widow to his room so he could forget the love of Firmina Daza. That's what happens here, because the widow had lost her home, her house, in an explosion, and she had no place to go, no place to sleep. But we found out later that she was doing the same with every single man and every single house around in the city. So she was sleeping left and right with a lot of men. In any event, it was Transito Ariza who took control of the situation and sent the widow to her son's bedroom on the pretext that there was no space in hers, but actually in the hope that another love will cure him of the one that did not allow him to live. Florentino Ariza had not made love since he lost his virginity to Rosalba in the cabin of the boat, and this emergency seemed natural to him that the widow should sleep in the bed and he should sleep in the hammock. But she had already made the decision for him. She sat on the edge of the bed where Florentino Ariza was laying, not knowing what to do, and she began to speak to him of her inconsolable grief for the husband who had died 3 years earlier. And in the meantime, she removed her widow's weeds and tossed them in the air until she was not even wearing her wedding ring. She took off the taffeta blouse with the beaded embroidery and threw it across the room into the easy chair in the corner. She tossed her bodies over her shoulder to the other side of the bed. With, with one pull, she removed her long ruffled skirt, her satin garter belt, and the funeral stockings. And she threw everything on the floor until the room was carpeted with the last remnants of her mourning. She did all this with so much joy and with such well measured pauses that each of her gestures seemed to be saluted by the cannon of the attacking troops, who shook the city down to its foundations. Florentino Ariza tried to help her unfasten her stays, but she anticipated him with a deft maneuver. For in 5 years of matrimonial devotion, she learned to depend on herself in all phases of love, even the preliminary stages, with no help from anyone. Then she removed her lace panties, sliding them down her legs with the rapid movements of a swimmer, and at last she was naked. She was 28 years old and had given birth to 3 times, but her naked body preserved intact the giddy excitement of an unmarried woman. Florentino Ariza was never to understand how a few articles of penitential clothing would have hidden the drives of what wild mare who, choking on her own feverish desire, undressed him as she had never been able to undress her husband, who would have thought her perverse and tried, with that confusion and innocence, of 5 years of conjugal fidelity, to satisfy in a single assault the iron abstinence of her mourning. Before that night, and from the hour of grace when her mother gave birth to her, she had never been in the same bed with any man other than her dead husband. She did not permit herself the vulgarity of remorse. On the contrary, kept awake by the gunfire whizzing over the roofs, she continued to evoke her husband's excellent qualities until daybreak, not reproaching him for any disloyalty other than his having died without her, which was mitigated by her conviction that he had never belonged to her as much as he did now that he was in the coffin nailed shut with a dozen 3-inch nails and 2 meters underground. I am happy, she said, because only now I do know for certain where he is when he's not home. That night, she stopped wearing mourning once and for all. without passing through the useless intermediate stage of blouses with little gray flowers, and her life was filled with love songs and provocative dresses decorated with macaws and spotted butterflies. And she began to share her body with anyone who cared to ask for it. When the troops of the General Gaitan Obeso were defeated after 63 days' siege, she rebuilt the house that had been damaged by the cannon fire, adding a beautiful sea terrace that overlooked a breakwater where the surf would vent its fury during the stormy season. That was her love nest, as she called it, without irony, where she would receive only men she liked, when she liked, how she liked, and without charging one red cent, because in her opinion, it was the men who were doing her a favor. And in very few cases, she would accept a gift as long as it was not made of gold. And she managed everything with so much skill that no one could have presented conclusive evidence of her improper conduct. On only one occasion did she hover over the edge of public scandal. When the rumor circulated that Archbishop Dante de Luna had not died by accident after eating a plate of poisonous mushrooms, but had eaten them intentionally because she threatened to expose him if he persisted of his sacrilegious solicitations. As she used to say in between pearls of laughter, she was the only free woman in the province. In the window Nazareth, that's the street, never missed her occasional appointments with Florentino Ariza. That's her name, Window Nazareth. Never missed her occasional appointments with Florentino Ariza, not even during her busiest times, and it was always without pretensions of loving or being loved, although always in the hope of finding something that resembled love, but without the problems of love. Sometimes she went to her house, and then they liked to sit on the sea terrace, drenched by salt spray, watching the dawn on the whole world on the horizon. With all his perseverance, he tried to teach her the tricks he had seen others perform through the peepholes in the transient hotel, along with theoretical formulations preached by Lothario Thugut on his nights of debauchery. He persuaded her to let themselves be observed while they made love, to replace the conventional missionary position with the bicycle on the sea, or the chicken on the grill, or the drone and quarter angel. And she almost broke their necks, and they almost broke their necks when the cord snapped as they were trying to devise something totally new in a hammock. The lessons, oh my God, the lessons were to not avail. The truth is that she was fearless apprentice, but lacked of all talent for guided fornication. She never understood the charm of serenity in bed, never had a moment of invention, and her orgasms were inopportune and epidermic, an uninspired lay. For a long, long time, Florentino Ariza lived with the deception that he was the only one, and she remembered him in that belief until she had bad luck to talk in her sleep. Little by little, listening to her sleep, he pieced all together the navigation charts of her dreams and sailed among the countless islands of her secret life. In this way, he learned that she did not want to marry him, but did feel joined, did feel joined to his life because of her immense gratitude for him for having corrupted her. She often said to him, "I adore you. You made me a whore." Said in another way, my God, there's a fly here. Flies on TV these days. Um, Said in another way, she was right. Florentino Ariza had stripped of her virginity of a conventional marriage. More pernicious than congenital virginity of a conventional marriage. More pernicious than congenital virginity or the abstinence of a widowhood. He had taught her that nothing one does in bed is immortal if it helps to perpetuate love. And something else that from that time on would be her reason for love. Oh, and something else for that time on would be her reason for living. He convinced her that the one comes into the world with a predetermined allotment of lays, and whoever does not use them for whatever reason, once owns someone else's willingly or unwillingly, loses them forever. It was to her credit that she took him at his word, still because he thought he knew her better than anyone else. Florentino Ariza could not understand why a woman of such puerile resources should be so popular. A woman, moreover, who never stopped talking in bed about the grief she felt for her dead husband. The only explanation he could think of, one that could not be denied, was that the widow Nazareth had enough tenderness to make up for what she lacked in the material arts. They began to see each other with less frequency as she widened her horizons, and he exploited his, trying to find solace in other hearts for his pain. And at last, with no sorrow, they forgot each other. That was Florentino Ariza's first bedroom love. But instead of their forming a permanent union of the kind his mother dreamt about, both used to embark on a profligate way of life. Florentino Ariza developed methods that seemed incredible in someone like him, taciturn, thin, and dressed like an old man from another time. He had two advantages working in his favor, however. One was an unerring eye that promptly spotted a woman, even in a crowd, who was waiting for him, though even he courted her with caution, for he felt that nothing was more embarrassing or more demeaning than a refusal. The other was that women promptly identify him as a solitary man in need of love, a street beggar as humble as white dog, who made them yield without conditions, without asking him for nothing, without hoping for anything from him except the tranquility of knowing they had done him a favor. These were his only weapons, and with them he joined in historic battles of absolute secrecy, which he recorded with the rigor of a notary in a coded book, recognizable among many others by the title that said everything: Women. His first notation was the widow Nazareth. Oh, that's right. So he decides to make a book called The Women, like we just read, to write all the women he had slept with and keep account of his sexual adventures. Because, like I said, he changed his love, poetically speaking, into an anxiety to sleep with people, to sleep with ladies. His first notation was the widow Nazareth. 50 years later, when Fermina Daza was freed from her sacramental sentence, he had some 25 notebooks with 622 entries of long-term liaisons, apart from the countless fleeting adventures that did not even deserve a charitable note. After 6 months of furious lovemaking with the widow Nazareth, Florentino Ariza himself was convinced that he had survived the torment of Fermina Daza. He not only believed it, he also discussed it with several times with Transito Ariza during the 2 years of Fermina Daza's wedding trip. And he continued to believe it, with a feeling of boundless freedom until one fateful Sunday when, with no warning and no presentiment, he saw her leaving High Mass on her husband's arm, besieged by the curiosity and flattery of the New World. The same ladies from fine families who at first had scorned and ridiculed her for being an upstart without a name went out of their way to make her feel like one of them, and she intoxicated them with her charm. She had assumed the condition of a woman of the world to such perfection that Florentino Ariza needed a moment of reflection to recognize her. She was a complete different person. The posture of an older woman, the high boots, the hat with the veil and colored plume from some oriental bird. Everything about her was distinctive and confident, as if it had been hers from birth. He found her more beautiful and youthful than ever, but more lost to him when she had ever been, but more lost to him than she had ever been, although he did not understand why until he saw the curve of her belly under the silk tunic that she was in her 6 months of pregnancy, but was impressed with him. But what was impressed him most was that she and her husband made an admirable couple, and both of them negotiated the world with so much fluidity that they seemed to float above the pitfalls of reality. Florentino Ariza did not feel either jealousy or rage, only great contempt for himself. He felt poor, ugly, inferior, and unworthy not only of her, but any other woman on the face of the earth. There is a fly and some bees. Feels like it's spring. Let me see. It's beautiful outside. I don't know if you guys have the opportunity to enjoy this morning. It's gorgeous outside. So she had returned. She came back without any reason to repent of the sudden change she had made in her life. On the contrary, she had fewer and fewer such reasons, above all after surviving the difficulties of the early years, which was especially admirable in her case, for she had come to her wedding night still trailing clouds of innocence. She had begun to lose them during her journey through cousin Hildebranda's province. In Valledupar, that's the city, she realized at least why the roosters chased the hens. She witnessed the brutal ceremony of the burros. She watched the birth of the calves, and she listened to her cousins talking with great naturalness with about it, which couples in the family still made love and which one ones had stopped, and when and why and when and why, even though they continued to live together. That's when she was initiated into solitary love, with the strange sensation of discovering something that her instincts had always known. First in bed, holding her breath so she would not give herself away in the bedroom, she shared with half a dozen cousins, and then, with the eagerness and unconcern sprawling on the bathroom floor, her, her hair loose, smoking her first mule driver's cigarette. She always did it with certain pangs of conscience, which she could overcome only after she was married, and always in absolute secrecy. Although her cousins boasted to each other not only about the number of orgasms they had in the day, but even about their form and even their size. But despite those bewitching first rites, she was still burdened by the beliefs that the loss of virginity was a bloody sacrifice. So after her wedding, one of the most spectacular of the final years of the last century was for her to prelude the horror to horror. The anguish of the honeymoon affected her much more than the social uproar caused by her marriage to the most incomparably elegant young man of the day. When the bans were announced at High Mass in the cathedral, Fermina Daza received anonymous letters again, some of them containing death threats, but she took scant notice of them because of all the fear of which she was capable was centered on the imminent violation. Although that was not her intention, it was the correct way to respond to anonymous letters from a class accustomed by the affronts of, of history to bow the fate's accomplice. So that little by little, they shallowed their opposition as it became clear that the marriage was irrevocable. She noticed the gradual changes in attention paid by the livid women, degraded by arthritis and resentment, who one day were convinced of the uselessness of their intrigues and appeared announced in the little park of the Evangels as if it were their own home, bearing recipes and engagement gifts. Chancito Arisa knew that world, although this was the only time it caused her suffering in her own person. And she knew that her clients always reappeared on the eve of the great parties to ask her please to dig down into the jars and lend them their pawn jewels for only 24 hours in exchange for the payment of additional interest. It had been a long while since it had occurred to the extent it did now. The jars emptied so that the ladies with long last names could emerge from their shadowy sanctuaries and, radiant in their own borrowed jewels, appear at a wedding more splendid than any that would have been seen for the rest of the century. And those ultimate glory was sponsorship by Dr. Rafael Nunez, the 3 times president of the Republic, philosopher, poet, and author of the words to the national anthem, which is absolutely true. This is absolutely true as well. As one could learn from that time on in some of the more recent dictionaries. Fermina Daza came to the main altar of the cathedral on the arm of her father, whose formal dress lent him, for the day, on an ambiguous air of respectability. She was married forever after at the main altar of the cathedral, with a mass at which 3 bishops officiated at 11 o'clock in the morning in the day of the Holy Trinity, and without a single charitable thought for Florentino Arisa, who at that hour was delirious with fever, dying because of her, lying without shelter on a boat that was not carry him to forgetting. During this ceremony, and later at the reception, she wore a smile that seemed painted on white lead, a soulless grimace that some interpreted as a mocking smile of victory, but in reality was her poor attempt at disgusting the terror of a virgin bride. It was fortunate that unforeseen circumstances combined with her husband's understanding resolved the first 3 nights without pain. It was providential. The ship of the oh my god, we're past the hour, sorry. So I'm gonna leave it right there. We're past the hour. Anyway, so I wanted to just read the last portion so you guys get an idea of what's happening. It was fortunate that unforeseen circumstances combined with her husband's understanding resolved the first 3 nights without pain. It was providential. The ship of the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, its itinerary upset by bad weather in the Caribbean, and announced only 3 days in advance that its departure had been moved ahead by 20 hours. so that he would not sail for La Rochelle on the day following the wedding, as had been planned for the past 6 months, but on the same night. No one believed that the change was not another of the many elegant surprises of the wedding had to offer, for the reception ended after midnight on board of the brightly lit ocean liner with a Viennese orchestra that premiering the most recent waltzes by Johann Strauss on this voyage, so that the various members of the wedding party, soggy with champagne, had to be dragged ashore by the long-suffering wives when they began to ask the stewards if there were any free cabins so they continued the celebration all the way to Paris. The last to leave saw Lorenzo Daza outside the port taverns, sitting on the ground in the middle of the street with his tuxedo in ruins. He was crying with Dementia's loud wails, the way Arabs cry for their dead, sitting in a trickle of full water that may well have been a pool of tears. So we're gonna continue reading these. I have some questions that I will answer, hopefully in the upcoming weeks. We, like I said, we're basically past half of the book. I believe it is. Yeah, we're past the half of the book, but I have all these questions that you guys are asking me. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you so much for sending me those questions. It's bright, it's sunny, but it's a beautiful day in the Sonora desert. So if you had lunch with me al fresco, thank you. And if you can have dinner al fresco, that'll be great given the current circumstances. Talk to you soon and thank you. See you on Friday for Espanol in Spanish, and see you next Monday for English. Thanks.